I think that that's probably the case with regard to what happened. And so some of you may not know that I was not one of the people who was asked to speak at the Florida Democratic Party Jefferson-Jackson dinner. And they wanted to shorten the time. And I thought it was cute that John Kennedy, a reporter from the Palm Beach Post, had a tweet where he said they got it all done in an hour and 34 minutes. Wonder what difference it would have been if it were an hour and 39 minutes with Senator Rich speaking. So anyway, and I had the privilege of seeing a lot of you here that are here today. Actually, this weekend down at the meeting in Hollywood, because I did have a little reception, and I just want to say that part of the strategy that I'm using as I run for governor is to go around the state and meet people in areas of the state that I do not know, areas that I have not been to, even though I've lived here almost all my life. And I've had over 200.
You want to move the mic a little bit?
Oh, thank you. All right, thank you. I've actually had over 200 events around the state since I announced my candidacy, and I have to tell you, it got announced in a funny way. I was giving a legislative update following the 2012 session, where I had been the Democratic leader, and I went to the Broward DEC, which is my home community, and gave my update. And when I finished, someone said from the back, yelled from the back, are you running for governor, and when are you announcing? And I just got the words, well, I am going to run for governor, out, and that was kind of it. It went on a YouTube. So by the time I left, everybody knew that I was running for governor. But I thought I should have been a little swifter, because the fellow that asked the question was wearing a pink slip rig shirt. That should have been my first hint. Anyway, I wanted to just talk a little bit to you today about the question that was asked, I think in the newspaper, in News Service of Florida, was, who is Nan Rich anyway? And do you think you can win? And I will tell you who I am, and I will tell you that I think, and I believe, that I will win this election. Let me just say, it was mentioned that I spent 12 years in the Florida legislature, 4 years in the House and 8 years in the Senate. And the last 2 years, I served as the first woman elected Democratic leader of the Senate, and I was very, very proud of that. And I didn't have the mightiest of caucuses, because in 2010 to 2012, there were 12 Democratic senators out of 40 state senators. And I tell you this by way of telling you a little bit about me, because obviously when you are leading a group of 12 and there are 40 votes, you can't really accomplish that much by yourself. You have to work with people. You have to work with your own colleagues, and you have to work with people across the aisle. And I think that most people would say that I actually do that, and I was very successful in doing that during my term of office as the leader. The 2012 session had a number of very difficult legislative issues, and some of them came back again this year. The one that you might be the most familiar with is the Parent Trigger Bill. And that bill was an attempt to privatize our public schools by turning them over to for-profit management companies. And all the Democrats stayed together on that issue, and we were able to have 8 Republicans cross over and join us. So on the very last day of session in 2012, that bill was defeated on a 2020 vote. And I have to just give you a little aside here. The other night in Pembroke Pines, which is a city that I represented, they have a wonderful charter school, not-for-profit charter school system. And I will tell you that the city was thinking about turning it over to a for-profit management company. And the parents and the teachers and students all came out the other night. And the city, I'm very happy to say, decided not to go ahead and turn it over to the for-profit management company. And one of the things that they would have done, and it was part of the plan, was that all the teachers would have been let go, and then the for-profit management company could have decided whether or not they wanted to hire those teachers back. And that's a terrible way, first of all, I think, to treat professionals. And this particular charter school system, although I don't like grading schools, it happens that this charter school system is an A system in Pembroke Pines and within the whole ranking and grading system of our public schools. So I was happy to see that did not happen there. And of course this year the legislature did again defeat that piece of legislation. One of the other areas where I did work across the aisle, and it's a very important area to me, and that's dealing with women's health and women's reproductive rights. Have enough votes again to stop things or to pass things, and I was able, by working across the aisle, to make sure that some very bad legislation dealing with placing barriers before women to make the decisions over their own lives, to see that legislation was not passed. And 2012 was the very 2012 was the first year in many, many years that there was no legislation passed with that regard. When this governor came into office, some of you, all of us probably remember the slogan that was used, "Let's get to work." But we really didn't know what that meant when he was using it and when he first got to office. But as the sessions unfolded, first 3 sessions, we learned what that meant. And it meant making it harder for people to vote. You remember the Voter Suppression Act in 2011? They worked to undermine public education and actually try to destroy public education. They worked to restrict women's reproductive rights. And probably the most egregious thing, I think, was working to block the Floridians from the benefits of the Affordable Care Act. None of these initiatives created a single job, even though the whole thrust of the administration was to be jobs, jobs, jobs. And worse yet, and you'll remember up here, since this community was impacted, the governor has turned away, and the legislature has turned away billions of dollars, tax dollars that are our dollars. We sent them to Washington to pay our taxes, and we deserve to get our fair share back in Florida. Well, the first move, of course, was the $2.4 billion for the high-speed rail that was returned. And that would have created, at a time when we were really desperate to create jobs in the state, that would have been the opportunity to create anywhere between 20,000 to 30,000 jobs. And I have to tell you a little story about this because there's some revisionist history going on about this whole issue. I remember the governor saying that he was returning that money because we had a deficit in the United States Treasury and that he did not want to take this money. Now, that money doesn't go back, as probably everyone in this room knows, to reduce the deficit of the United States. Instead, it goes to other states. And the reason I know that, specifically with this amount of money, is that a number of months ago, I'm very involved in foster care issues and children aging out of the foster care system. And a congresswoman from California came to Florida for a meeting of the Congressional Foster Care Caucus. Her name is Karen Bass, and she's a congresswoman from Los Angeles. And when I got to the meeting, she came over to me and gave me a big hug and a kiss and introduced herself and said, "Thank you." And I said, "For what? I've never met you before." And her answer was, "For the $1 billion that California got of Florida money that enabled the legislature in California to give the final approval for the high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles." So our money didn't go to reduce the deficit, it went to another state. And the rest of that money went to 2 other areas of the country as well. The legislature also did not request or accept money from several other programs. Money Follows the Person, which is to keep frail elderly out of nursing homes, the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Program, which is for child abuse prevention. All this money was not drawn down to Florida. But the most egregious, as I mentioned, really has to do with the Affordable Care Act, and that is the $51 billion that the legislature and the governor refused or did not draw down from the federal government. Now, you will all remember, I'm sure, that the governor, for about 5 years, he was opposed to the Affordable Care Act, and he had a pact of about $5 million that went towards trying to undermine it and make sure that it didn't pass. Well, you know, it did pass, and right before this session, or right at the beginning of this session, he indicated that he would support Medicaid expansion. Well, you know, when you say that, you need to do something about it. And I think the biggest problem was that the governor provided no leadership at all when it came to this. He said it, and that was the end of it. But then we know that that's kind of a pattern, because he doesn't get involved in legislation or legislative leadership. He has not in the 3 years that 3 sessions that he has been there. So instead, he deprived, at this point, he had deprived over 1 million Floridians from receiving health care. They will not be able to access it in January when the Medicaid expansion goes into effect. But also, I think it's important for people to note, and I know probably a lot of people in this room are aware, that this happens to be devastating for our hospitals as well. Because the subsidies in Obamacare, in the Affordable Care Act, the subsidies for uncompensated care actually go away. And they are to be replaced by Medicaid expansion. That was the way the bill was written, and that's what is supposed to happen. But if a state does not take Medicaid expansion, and the subsidies go away, you can see what happens to the hospitals, particularly your safety net hospitals, your hospitals and your children's hospitals, like All Children's Hospital and Miami Children's Hospital, who have about 70% Medicaid patients. So it's a devastating impact on the hospitals. And again, for someone who thinks about jobs, or says they think about jobs, the University of Florida has studied to show that over the 10 years, 120,000 jobs would be created by the implementation of Medicaid expansion, because to insure over 1 million people, you obviously need to have additional health care providers. And those are good jobs, good, permanent, and good paying jobs. So put simply, I think there are a few decisions in my mind that Governor Scott has made that I believe are in the best interest of Floridians. And that's why I'm running for governor. I think, as I mentioned, the majority of Floridians don't want our public schools privatized. Floridians want health care coverage for everybody. A majority of Floridians want women's reproductive rights protected. And lastly, I would say that Floridians want to have their right to vote. Now, I can tell you that in Miami-Dade County, I had some of Miami-Dade along with Broward in my district. In Miami-Dade County, people waited in line, and I know they did in other parts of the state, till they waited in line and voted at 1:30 in the morning. That's when the polls closed. And they knew who had been elected president. They knew who had been elected United States Senator and many of the other positions. But they stayed in line because they did not want anyone to take away their right to vote. So these are, again, as I mentioned, some of the reasons why I believe we need to have new leadership and new direction. And that's what I have found traveling this state. I am a lifelong Democrat, and I'm very proud of that. I see a lifelong Democrat, Helen Gordon Davis, sitting here too. I don't know if Helen was introduced, but she's been a role model for me over the years. I'm a Democrat because I believe in the values that I see in the Democratic Party, values of fairness, of putting people first, of believing in civil rights, and making sure that all individuals are protected regardless of race, creed, age, gender, sexual orientation. I have fought for these rights as a state representative, as a state senator, and as I mentioned, the first woman elected to lead the Senate Democratic Caucus. And I am prepared and ready to be governor. So now I get to the last question that is in the article. Can you win? Well, I believe I can. Number one, because of the grassroots efforts that I'm conducting around this state. But, you know, people say, well, you haven't run for statewide office before. That's true. But I want to give you a little bit of Florida campaign history. When Reuben Askew ran for governor, he was a little-known state senator from northern Florida. When Lawton Child began walking the stage in 1970 when he wanted to be United States Senator, he was a little-known senator from central Florida. And when Bob Graham, who was a longtime friend of mine, and I actually worked on his first campaign, when he decided that he wanted to run for governor, he was a little-known state senator from South Florida with actually a 3% name recognition at the time. I'm glad to say that mine is up to 12 now. But you know what? They were all candidates they faced better-known opponents and better-financed opponents, but they all won. They worked hard, and they understood and knew the state of Florida, and they won. So I intend to carry on that tradition, the tradition of what I consider to be three of Florida's greatest leaders, by earning the trust and votes of the majority of voters in November 2014. I made history when I was elected the first woman leader of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and I plan on making history by being elected the first woman governor of the state of Florida. Thank you.
We'll start with the questions, and I'll walk around the room. If everyone could introduce themselves so the Garfield Committee knows their name.
I guess to put it kindly, our last two Democratic candidates for governor